In 1924, C.F. Seabrook retired unexpectedly, quote unquote, as the Bridgeton Evening News put it, as general manager of Seabrook Farms. Charles F. Seabrook was the president and active head from the formation of the company until his retirement yesterday. Under his guiding hand, this small and insignificant enterprise grew and grew and grew. With its enlargement came the interest and fame of its achievements. CF, as he is commonly known, surrounded himself not only with land and equipment, but with men. A wonderful student of character and men, he built an organization competent to conduct and manage this great enterprise in its every branch. There is not a weak link in the chain. And here is the Henry Ford of agriculture himself with a steam shovel. Now, if you don't come from a farm background, you might think it is unusual for a man to be both a farmer and a road contractor. The farmer husbands the soil so that it remains fertile year after year. The contractor pours concrete and molten tar over it, ensuring the earth will not grow anything again for a long time. But, in fact, farmers were among the first road paving contractors when roads outside of cities first began to be paved in the early 20th century. Farmers already had the work crews. For farmers like CF who relied on seasonal farm labor, road building offered ideal off-season work to keep those workers employed. Farmers also had deposits of stone, gravel, and sand on their land, which could be used to make both concrete and asphalt, the two main paving surfaces. Farmers built roads for business reasons to get their goods to market, but the farmers' roads benefited lots of other people too. When the dirt roads were muddy, like Parsonage Road here in Deerfield, which was the road CF and the family lived on until 1924, which is around the time this photograph of Seabrook peach orchards was taken, farmers couldn't get their goods to market, but also doctors couldn't reach the sick, and your social world was severely constrained. Roads were also undermining the truck farmers' business, which was based on being the southernmost growing region that could reach New York in a day by rail. With good roads, truck farmers in warmer climates, such as Virginia, then Georgia, then Florida, could get their goods to the northeastern cities in a day or two also. You might say CF literally paved the way to Seabrook Farms I's bankruptcy, but I suspect he made a lot more out of road building than he made out of farming. CF also had experience in building 2 railroad spurs on the farm, beginning in 1913. This is a picture of Seabrook's men building one of those railroad spurs. Note the mules in the picture. In a lot of these pictures, you see both horsepower and machine power coexisting, reminding us that the 1910s and early 20s was a crucial time of transition on the farm as the first wave of mechanization began to break over agriculture. These early pictures show steam, not internal combustion, as the source of power. By the early 1920s, Seabrook Farms I's infrastructure was mostly in place, so CF began looking outside the farm for more road building projects. After the First World War, the federal and state governments began pouring money into road paving. And so for a road contractor, the early part of the 1920s truly was a golden age. But the road to success in road contracting was paved with politics. To win the bids for the jobs, CF needed political power. And his solution to this wasn't all that subtle, but it was effective. He got himself made a New Jersey highway commissioner. No sooner had he been installed than he and his fellow commissioners promptly awarded CF's company, Tri-State, with a contract to pave then Route 6 from Bridgeton to the Cumberland-Salem line. As part of a new state highway, now called Highway 77, Route 6 was the first of several contracts that the State Highway Commission awarded to CF's various contracting companies over the next few years. Altogether, his companies got contracts worth more than $1 million during his 2-year term as State Highway Commissioner. This is CF's company paving Route 6, now Route 77, in 1921. You can see machinery has come a long way from the mules and the steam shovels of earlier times. When CF built roads around Deerfield, he sometimes bordered them with sycamore trees, such as those that had once lined the approach to his house on Polk Lane. These trees gave his roads a stately appearance and also, of course, earned him an additional commission since they came from Coster Nursery, which he also owned. He also got jobs in New York State, like this one, on Tongue Mountain. CF's oldest son, Belford, headed up road building crews for his father from the time he was 13 when he worked on Route 6. Belford headed a crew for the Tongue Mountain job, which involved paving a very treacherous stretch of road over Tongue Mountain on the west side of Lake George that many crews would have refused because of that area's dense rattlesnake population. We found a number of workman's comp cases from that job. The work of road building could be dangerous, and inexperienced farmhands who manned the machines often got hurt. There were many workman's comp awards filed against CF's company. In 1926, Belford was a crew boss for CF in Philadelphia, where he was badly hurt when his foot was caught in a tractor. What, you might ask, did CF Seabrook actually know about civil engineering? Well, whatever it was, he hadn't learned it in the classroom. There was no evidence that his education lasted longer than 8th grade, and he claimed that he quit school in 3rd grade to work part-time for his father. Early in their marriage, which began in 1905, the same year CF became his father's partner, Norma Dale Ivins helped him with some correspondence courses that may have earned him some kind of degree. But for the most part, he learned about engineering on job sites by building things. He was like a builder from an earlier era when engineering was not a science that was studied in schools, but making things stand up was more like a seat of the pants reckoning process. During this period, which lasted from 1924 to 1931, CF was living his best life. He had finally left farming, which he had hated from boyhood, behind him, or so he thought, and could travel the world. He spent his time in the great capital cities of Europe. There were supposedly Seabrook Engineering branch offices in London, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow. He made multiple ocean crossings each year. It took 8 days to cross by ship in the 1920s, a distance we fly in under 7 hours today. The Berengaria was CF's preferred ocean liner. The huge drawing room of the Berengaria was a laboratory for the farm boys' immersion courses in the manners and mores of the British upper class, the clothes they wore and the wines they poured, and the liquors they drank after dinner, their politics, their snobberies, and their anti-Semitism. Charlie Seabrook, the sharecropper's son, used the vital information he assiduously scraped from the Berengaria's drawing room to live like an English feudal lord in Deerfield, transforming the house he purchased on Polk Lane in 1928 into a great country estate, complete with the elaborate gardens he'd seen at the great English country estates that he had been invited to for weekends in the 1920s and 30s. In these years, his main business entity was CF Seabrook Engineering, headquartered at 50 Church Street in the Wall Street area of New York City, about 100 yards or so from where my office at the New Yorker is now, on the 38th floor of One World Trade. The building was also called the Hudson Terminal, and it was the terminus of the city's once extensive elevated rail system, now all gone except for the High Line Park on Manhattan's west side. This is how it looks today. My office is right behind it up there on the 38th floor. When he wasn't abroad, CF's habit was to spend the week in New York City staying at the Engineers Club, located on the south side of Bryant Park near the public library. Here is the building seen from across Bryant Park. Oddly, I could see this building from my office window in the old New Yorker offices on 43rd Street, and it too was about 100 yards away. The Engineers Club was founded by Andrew Carnegie in 1907, and its members included Thomas Edison, Herbert Hoover, Charles Lindbergh, George Westinghouse, and Nikola Tesla, who CF would have been able to observe feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, as the inventor of alternating current liked to do from time to time. This is how the dining room at the Engineers Club looked when CF was taking his meals there. By 1923, CF was no longer a New Jersey highway commissioner. He continued to get road building work in the state, and when the new Delaware River Bridge started to go up at Camden, one of his companies built the New Jersey approaches to the later named Ben Franklin Bridge. But there was even bigger game afoot across the river in Philadelphia, where the fairgrounds for the ill-fated Philadelphia Sesquicentennial Exhibition of 1926 were hastily being prepared. The center city of Philadelphia as it looks today was built on its monumental scale mostly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The subway, the art museum, and the Beaux-Arts City Hall itself were all constructed during this period. These projects were marked by massive graft and gave rise to a culture of so-called contractor bosses. Big Philadelphia builders and local politicians made deals that enriched each other with taxpayers' money. The Sesqui Exposition was born out of this culture of graft and corruption. In his book, Sesqui, historian Thomas Keels calls the Sesqui Exposition, quote, an allegory for the ongoing struggle between the yin and yang of Philadelphia, caught between the gleaming vision of William Penn's virgin settlement and the sordid reality of its pay-to-play politics. The Sesqui also turned out to be part of the ongoing struggle between the yin and yang of C.F. Seabrook, and in Philly, the yang of pay-to-play won. In the 1920s, Bear was the boss of Philadelphia's Republican political machine, known as the Organization. Bear's political base and stronghold was swampy South Philadelphia. Pay-to-play politics and self-dealing were his bread and butter. His own contracting company was rarely without a lucrative building project paid for by the city. Sold to the public as a world-class exposition to rival the one in Paris, the Sesquicentennial was supposed to be located on Fairmount Parkway in the city's cultural center. But Vere wanted the fair relocated to his South Philadelphia stronghold, and with less than a year to go, Vere's man in City Hall, Mayor Vreeland Kendrick, a former pawn shop owner, agreed. According to Thomas Keels, quote, this move alone guaranteed the fair's failure, since it added millions of dollars in development costs and delayed construction. In addition to widespread graft, the Sesqui was plagued with bad weather and poor attendance. City planners expected 50 million guests, fewer than 5 million came. The fair lost more than $1 million in 1926 money, and its organizing body went bankrupt. According to my father's memoir of his father, the Henry Ford of Agriculture, C.F. Seabrook did 1/3 of all the contracting work for the Sesquicentennial. How did he get this gig? Here is the old man in his own words, as quoted in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1928. Our company, he explained, had the contract for most of the work in grading the circle near the Camden approach of the Delaware River Bridge. We were nearly through that contract in the spring of 1926 when we got word that there was trouble at the Sesqui, that Mayor Kendrick wanted to open on the scheduled date, and that it would take some extraordinary bustling to get the grounds in order in time. I went over to the Sesqui and asked if there's anything I could do to help. Indeed, there was a lot that C.F. Seabrook could do to help, starting with the Gladway, as part of the fairgrounds was known. He got the contract for that. C.F. was also a nurseryman. The Coster Nursery was fully 1/3 of the business, And so he also took on a lot of last-minute landscaping for the Sesqui. Later, when CF sued to collect for this work, someone pointed out that the bushes CF's men had planted around the fairground had no root systems. They had simply been scalped from the Coster nursery over in Cumberland County and propped up with some dirt on the fairgrounds. So, of course, they quickly turned brown and died. When the Sesqui's organizing committee went bankrupt in early 1927, many contractors and subcontractors went unpaid, but not CF. He had the bright idea of hiring Mayor Kendrick's former law partner, a man named George Clowder, who also happened to be head of the Sesquicentennial Creditors Committee, as a kind of private lobbyist for his own interests. CF was quite upfront about this. Quote, "Someone told me George C. Clowder would actually pay the bills," CF said. "I asked him to represent me in the claims we had against the Sesqui." Unquote. Here are some of the expenses he claimed. CF did collect his Sesqui money, and had he left the matter there, no trouble would have ensued. But CF Seabrook was never content to leave matters there. CF organized multiple contracting and construction companies, some with Philadelphia headquarters. His businesses eventually included Tri-State Construction Company, the Good Roads Company, CF Seabrook Engineering Company, and the CF Seabrook Company in Pennsylvania. There was the Keystone Machinery and Equipment Company and the Philadelphia Contracting and Engineering Company. He sought to conceal his ownership in all of these entities. Using George Clowder's insider connections to the organization, CF's firms proceeded to win contract after contract. His Elastic Hose Company sold the city valves for fire hoses at inflated prices. Another company sold the city a supposedly patented kind of steel called multi-steel, which turned out to be ordinary steel with a 200% markup. Clowder was the go-between in all these deals. By mid-1928, the scale of the graft was too much even for the city of Philadelphia, where now Kendrick had been replaced as mayor by another former law partner of his, Harry S. Mackey. That summer, Philadelphia City Controller William Hadley and District Attorney Monahan accused C.F. Seabrook of being, quote, the mastermind behind a plot to monopolize all city contracts in Philadelphia, using Clowder's connections to the organization. This story from the Vineland paper says, quote, Clowder conducted a high-pressure sales campaign for Keystone Construction, going to the length of utilizing stationery of the Mackey Clowder law firm with the mayor's name delicately crossed over to push the interests of the Keystone Company with city contractors, unquote. The story also notes, quote, C.F. Seabrook was summoned to appear in the office of District Attorney Monahan yesterday, but it is said that Seabrook has left Philadelphia, unquote. Mayor Mackey initially defended Clowder and CF. The Philadelphia Inquirer story reads in part, quote, Mayor Mackey angrily pounded the table, thus yesterday resoundingly denounced the controller's probe into city contracts and his disclosures of the activities of the mayor's friend and former law partner, George C. Clowder. Mackey declared, quote, they talk about C.F. Seabrook, treasurer of the Keystone Machinery and Equipment Company. Seabrook was not a fly-by-night contractor. He was not a thief. He is a big man, and everything he is connected with has real money of his own behind it. He might have been spared the scandal of front-page headlines had he not attracted the interest of a crusading young reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer named Harold J. Wigand, who was then just at the beginning of a stellar career that would eventually lead to the top of the paper's masthead by the 1970s. Wigand, writing for a Republican paper, wrote a series of muckraking articles peeling back the layers of the Seabrook-Clowder-Mayor Mackey combine. Many were on the front page. Local papers picked up the news and it became a full-blown scandal. Given the amount of publicity these stories generated, it seems remarkable how effectively this episode has been erased from C.F. Seabrook's biography CF was never charged with a crime, but he was banned from taking part in any more public works for the city of Philadelphia forever. So, what does CF do at this point? What does any big shot American businessman do when he needs an infusion of fresh capital and the usual sources in the US have stopped giving it to him because they don't trust him anymore? He goes to Russia, of course. This is a contract between CF Seabrook Engineering and the Bolshevik-led Soviet Union, dated 1930, to build 5,000 miles of roads in Moscow. We found it with the help of a Russian researcher and writer who ended up becoming part of the story in the State Economic Archives in Moscow. One of over 40 U.S. engineering firms, equipment makers, and factory designers and operators who the Soviets brought over to help with Joseph Stalin's so-called 5-year plan to modernize Russia, launched in 1928. Henry Ford was an unlikely hero of the Soviet leaders. Stalin and his colleagues felt that by employing Fordist methods of production, factories, assembly lines, and tailorist time motion studies that would supercharge worker efficiency, the Soviets would be able to leapfrog the bourgeois phase of development that had corrupted the West and skip right to the higher proletarian phase, as outlined by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. The Russian Revolution, of which Lenin was the intellectual architect, occurred in 1917, but the US government did not officially recognize the USSR until 1933, when FDR finally established diplomatic relations. Through the 1920s, there was no Soviet embassy in the US. However, there was growing trade between the two countries. US multinationals like Ford and DuPont saw in the USSR a vast potential market and were eager to make deals with the Soviets, as were the Soviets with them, provided the Americans would accept promissory notes for the work to be paid out of Russia's supply of gold bullion, the only form of exchange that existed between the two nations. In the absence of a diplomatic outpost, the only quasi-official Soviet representative in the US was the official Soviet trade organization, which was called AMTORG, short for the American Trading Company, and was based in New York City, first in the Wall Street area and later on Lower Fifth Avenue. For any American company doing business with the Soviets, AMTORG was the go-between. Partial lists of those companies included Ford Motor Company, General Electric Company, DuPont Nemours and Company, the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, Hugh L. Cooper and Company Incorporated for $100 million hydroelectric power, Arthur G. McGee and Company, a builder of steel mills, the Hercules Motor Company, the Goodman Manufacturing Company, the architect Albert Kahn, who designed a Russian tractor plant, and some 40 other companies, one of which was Seabrook Company. AMTORG also became the de facto headquarters of Soviet espionage, which at that point focused mainly on stealing American technology, much as China's military hacking groups do now.
This sailing marks the inauguration of the first regular service to the Soviet Union of vessels flying the American flag.
This man's name was Saul Braun, and he was the head of AMTORG in New York from 1927 till 1930, when he was transferred to AMTORG's London office. That's a Yiddish accent that he's speaking with.
In the past 5 years, hundreds of foreign ships have been sent by us to Leningrad and other Soviet ports with cargoes of American products worth nearly $500 million. I wish to assure you that in spite of the absence of normal relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, this ship will be welcome to the Soviet Union no less than the vessels of countries having regular
He lived on the Upper
relations with
West Side of Manhattan with his wife and two children. One of the biggest contracts he signed was with Henry Ford himself for $30 million worth of Ford cars and parts and technical assistance. It is no surprise that C.F. Seabrook, the Henry Ford of agriculture, would be of interest to the Soviets. Who better to help out with Stalin's 5-year plan than the man who had already enacted his own 5-year plan right here in Cumberland County when, with other people's money, he built the infrastructure of Seabrook Farms in a 5-year whirlwind of construction between 1912 and 1917. C.F. Seabrook had already transformed a 19th century agrarian society into a 20th century industrial one, right here in Seabrook, New Jersey. At the breathtaking audacity of this bony Jersey boy, who stood 5'8" in his shoes, to go from building roads around Seabrook Farms to building a third of the Sespe Centennial was a big step. But for a wannabe Philadelphia contractor boss to become one of the top American engineers assisting Joseph Stalin and the Supreme Soviet in building the infrastructure for a modern society of workers, that's quite an act of what Saul Braun might have called chutzpah, especially if, like C.F. Seabrook, you weren't actually an engineer at all. Not the Philadelphia organization. The Supreme Soviet was not a pay-to-play gang. But while the Soviet leaders were not susceptible to bribery, they may have been vulnerable to American PR, another Yankee invention that the Russians took from us and adapted to Soviet-style state propaganda. This story says, in part, quote, construction contracts totaling $150 million, in part fulfillment of the road program recently undertaken by the government of Soviet Russia, have been awarded to the C.F. Seabrook Company, one of the largest road building firms in this country, against strong French and British competition, it was recently learned. The contracts would spread over 6 years and call for construction of 10,000 miles of roads in the province of Moscow, Mr. Seabrook said. $150 million. I imagine when C.F. Seabrook wrote down those numbers, he made them very big indeed. The story also says that the contract includes not just roads, but also canals, docks, irrigation projects, and a host of other infrastructure improvements. In the fall of 1929, CF had his lead engineer, a man named R. Ettinger Breed, prepare a 78-page report on roads in Moscow and its provinces, with detailed proposals of the materials and equipment they would require. His team was assisted by Russian engineers, led by an engineer named Paraletrius, who had a son named Paraletrius Jr. CF arranged for a delegation of these and other Russian engineers to visit Seabrook Farms in 1930. They were touring the great engineering works in the U.S., and naturally they had to visit Seabrook. CF bought a great amount of road building equipment from companies such as Case and Caterpillar, for which he was the international distributor, the latest steamrollers and graders and portable asphalt making machines for paving Moscow roads never before paved. Since he was also working on promise of future payment from the Soviets, he persuaded the equipment makers to accept future payment too. Why would they go along with this? Let's remember that the stock market had crashed in October 1929, triggering the Great Depression. Because of the falling domestic economy, the vast potential Russian market became all the more important to big U.S. companies, and they were willing to extend credit when they might otherwise have been more cautious. They would regret it. In the spring of 1930, CF took a team of engineers and workers, including some from the Bridgeton area, and brought them all over to Moscow. The Seabrook crew started paving Moscow streets in the spring of 1930. In Moscow, CF set up his headquarters in the luxurious Savoy Hotel. Isaac Stanley Walker was not one of CF's engineers, but he intersected with his team in Moscow, and he wrote about them in a short memoir called A Trip to Russia 1930. In one of several passages that mention CF, It sounds as if he's not living in much hardship. June 8, 1930. Dinner party at the Savoy with about 15 of Seabrook's men and Mr. Seabrook. Others include Messrs. Hitchcock, Nash, Shattuck, Smith, Bessie, Milligan, Petralius Sr. and Jr., and Skinner. Very fine dinner. Have better impression of Russian cooking. Vodka, cognac, wine. In room after dinner with men until 11. When CF returned to Seabrook in August of 1930, he gave a talk at the Bridgeton Rotary Club in which he painted a rosy picture of the work in Russia so far. From the Vineland Journal's report, quote, Seabrook said that his company is working with the Russian government in the paving of approximately 2,000 miles of streets and roads in the city of Moscow and the province, that the roads vary from the finest type of concrete base roads, asphalt on concrete, oil macadam, and gravel, that work is progressing in a satisfactory manner. The contract involves the expenditure of $20 million. When over in Russia earlier this year, Mr. Seabrook closed on another contract for works on roads in Turkestan, Central Asia, and 2,000 laborers are now engaged in the grading of roads in the cradle of civilization. Mr. Seabrook is working on a contract for an irrigation program in the cotton sections of Turkestan involving an expenditure of $100 million by the Soviet government. Excavation has been in progress since last December, and the work involves moving 165 million cubic yards of earth. I have found no record of any of these other contracts, but it's hard to even start to know where to look in some cases. But sometime between that August and November of 1930, something went seriously wrong with the road surfaces that C.F. Seabrook's engineers had put down in Moscow. This is a Russian automotive journal called Za Rulim, or Let's Roll, dated November 22, 1930. In this issue, they publish pictures of the Seabrook roads. There's also a long article about the Seabrook project written by a Russian engineer that reads in part, We saw Seabrook started the job without taking into consideration the quality of our building materials, which are different from the American ones, and the conditions of our street traffic, horse-drawn transport. We warned them about it in writing, but they responded, Never mind, we'll manage. But manage they failed. Why? First, they did not have enough qualified engineers to train our workers. There were instances when, for example, during excavating, they were completely helpless and had to turn for help to an American operator who had worked for us earlier. Second, they started the job without prior laboratory testing of the materials, using in all instances American compounds not useful under our conditions. I want to add that our contract with the American firm has a clause according to which the Americans not only build the roads, but they are also responsible for their quality. At this time, we have filed a lawsuit against Seabrook for the losses in connection with the damages. What exactly happened to the road? In the book History of Road Construction Service in Moscow by A. Lagunov, there is this passage referring to CF's company. The American road specialists used a sand-asphalt mix and small and large grade asphalt bitumen, along with other compounds that did not include either natural Shugrov bitumen or asphalt powder. Such asphalt was used in servicing some other streets. The sand asphalt surface had already begun to deteriorate in 1930. After rain, it flaked and cracked. Water saturated the surface layer of the asphalt. It lost density and easily crumbled under horse-drawn transport. Unquote. At any rate, the work was a disaster, and CF wasn't paid for it, and he may have been sued for it. That meant all the equipment manufacturers gave CF their big road-making machinery on credit weren't paid either. Many of these companies evidently sued CF Seabrook Engineering back here in the US for payment, although we have yet to find any of those suits. Also, it is unclear whether any of the Seabrook engineers were paid. I suspect by the pall of silence that falls over this project after 1930 that they were not. In fact, it's a testament to C.F. Seabrook's Soviet-style control of his official biography that we had to go all the way to the Soviet archives in Moscow to find the contract to build the Moscow roads. My father's older brother, Belford, says in an unpublished memoir that CF went back to the USSR in 1931 to collect funds owed to him and was away for 11 months. But whether he was successful in collecting or not, we don't know. We do know that many of the other larger engineering firms that signed Amtor contracts didn't get paid either because the Soviets were worried about further depleting their supply of bullion. On August 25, 1931, Stalin called for a definitive break with all American engineering and contracting companies, saying, quote, "Due to difficulties with hard currency and unacceptable credit terms, I propose to ban placement of new orders in America, call off any negotiations for new orders that have already begun, and, wherever possible, terminate the contracts for orders which have already been negotiated, transferring those orders to Europe or our own plants. I propose to make no exceptions." Unquote. So I suspect CF never collected, and his contracting career was effectively over. Certainly the rosy view of the communists that CF expressed at the Rotary Club in Bridgeton in August 1930 had hardened after 1932, and by the time of the 1934 strikes at Seabrook, CF was an ardent anti-communist who blamed outside agitators for turning his workers against him. However, although Stalin seems to have stiffed him, CF may not have returned from Russia empty-handed. According to family tradition, one night while CF was in St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad, trying to collect his money, a Soviet official brought him into the former Tsar Nicholas II's wine cellar at the Winter Palace and allowed him to pick out a priceless jeweled bottle of wine, which CF brought back to Polk Lane and kept in his cellar. But if that's true, we've never found the bottle. With characteristic energy, as the Russian job was going pear-shaped, CF was organizing yet another venture, a group of investors who bought back the assets of Seabrook Farms from the receivership in 1930 and took over the business again. Certainly, CF made out a lot better than Saul Braun and his family. In 1938, after returning to Russia, Braun was arrested and charged with being a foreign spy. He was forced to sign a fake confession and shot. His body was dumped in a mass grave. His wife was placed in a prison camp where she died, never seeing their two children again. The Soviet engineers who visited Seabrook Farms in 1930 were also reportedly liquidated too, including both Paratraliuses, Sr. and Jr. I learned some of this from this scholarly paper by Sonia Melenkova-Reich. Sonia was also the person who helped me with the Russian State Archives, where I found CF's contract. And she found and translated the articles from Let's Roll. What I didn't know until I had been corresponding with Sonia for a while was that Saul Braun was her great uncle. When I went to see her in San Francisco, Sonia told me the moving story of how, when she was a child, no one would speak of her great uncle, who was then still a non-person in the early 1950s. After spending several decades as a non-person, Saul Braun was rehabilitated when Sonia was less than 10 years old. There was never much talk about him around her family into the 1970s. And then, as she later wrote me, everybody that I could talk to had died. She went on, "I always knew about his work for Amtorg and that he was important. I just didn't know how important he was. It was only after my coming to the US, after the USSR collapsed, that I started thinking of digging it up." She served me lunch in her apartment, and we looked through pictures of her ancestors, including the confession Braun was made to sign, admitting to the false charge of espionage, which Sonia had also obtained from the state archives. Sonia also gave me this picture of the apartment building in which the family lived in Manhattan in the 1920s, but she didn't know where it was. With some detective work and the help of Google Maps, I was able to figure out the location of this building, and it's still there, 35 West 96th Street, just down the street from Central Park West. It was an emotional moment for both of us when I sent this picture to her. It was exciting to find the porch where the Brons were standing, but it was sad too, because I felt like I was 90 years too late and they were long gone now, and I couldn't save them. But maybe in a way, I'm doing what I can to save them now, or at least save their memory. And meeting Sonia and helping each other with our separate projects on our ancestors does give the Saul Braun and C.F. Seabrook story a somewhat happier ending than the one in which everyone except C.F. gets shot. And finally, what are we to make of C.F. Seabrook's engineering career? It certainly sounds like he messed up in Moscow. In Philadelphia, he allowed hubris to get the better of him. But while you do have to wonder about his moral compass, you can't doubt his ambition, his energy, or his imagination. He may have misrepresented his abilities, but if so, he would not be the first great man who did so. Thomas Edison himself lied about inventing the incandescent light bulb for years before he'd actually come up with one that worked. Fake it till you make it, as they say in Silicon Valley. So I'm inclined to cut the old man a break here. The roaring 20s were a glorious decade for him, warts and all, and he roared with it. The 30s, which sees the beginning of Seabrook Farms 2, is going to be a much darker decade for C.F. Seabrook, as this last stamp in his passport from this era, from 1937, foreshadows. In Seabrook Farms 2, the old man from Seabrook Farms 1, now 10 years older, will encounter labor unions and civil rights, and he won't like that much at all. There will be blood.